We have this report now. We have the Chinese version. We have some tweets out of President Trump. We haven't seen the text. But from what we've heard so far, it appears that we won't go forward with the new tariffs December 15. We'll reduce to 7.5% the tariffs that were put on September 1, and maybe some more phase down of tariffs going forward. From your point of view, does that make sense to try to hold the Chinese to their bargain and make sure that they do whatever they say they're going to do?
I can't argue with having some kind of leverage. My whole approach toward the Chinese would have been quite different. I would have worked with my allies. But I think that reducing the tariffs, which is really hurting our businesses and our farmers and our workers, is going in the right direction. It is something that we have really suffered from if you look at the statistics.
At the same time, we just heard from the president in the Oval Office. He was meeting with the Paraguayan president. We addressed trade, and he said we're going to have at least $50 billion a year in Chinese purchases of agricultural products from the United States. Does that, to some extent, vindicate the president's approach? That sounds like a pretty good concession to the United States.
Well, I haven't read the agreement. It would be extraordinary to have a $50 billion commitment up front on, but you could get there if you go beyond agriculture and have equipment, manufacturing, and so forth. It could elicit some complaints from our allies who say, you know, that's breaching your national treatment and non-discrimination commitments that you complain about. But let's see. I don't want to complain about the agreement until I have had a chance to read it.
Yeah, well, that certainly is fair. But address one thing I suspect you do know about. The Chinese, when they're addressing this in their news conference, said, OK, we're going to increase our agricultural purchases, no question, subject to WTO provisions and subject also to the marketplace. Explain how that might limit, perhaps, what the Chinese could buy from us.
Well, they're going to have to make a decision. They have been, historically, our largest purchaser of soybeans. So if they go back to their top purchases, that will be a good thing. I think we are super competitive. But let's see how it works out. I think that to the extent that we are trying to drive China to adopt market principles, to abide by national treatment and non-discrimination, we need to fashion our partial agreement to be compliant also.
We're speaking with former U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Carla Hills. And Ambassador Hills, you mentioned earlier the need to have allies in. Thus far, we've done this bilaterally. But this is the so-called phase one. There's a phase two. There maybe there's a phase three. As we go forward to what may be more difficult issues, intellectual property issues, issues of subsidies from the government to industry, is it all the more important in that situation to have the allies?
Well, I think that, you know, you stand in front of China with Europe, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and really a total of more than 60% of global GDP, and say, these are the things we need to have fixed. Give us a blueprint of how you're going to address them. You know you committed to do these things in 2001, and I think we would have far more leverage with far less pain than by relying on unilateral tariffs.
If you were back in your old position and you were advising the President of the United States today, what would you tell him is the realistic expectations? Let's pick one in particular, subsidies. China has a very differently structured economy than the United States or the West, for that matter. This is sort of essential to a state-run economy. What's realistic to get them to concede? They're not going to throw away their state-run economy, presumably.
Well, they are trying to go more toward the market. And we do business with other countries that have state-owned enterprises. In fact, we do. CalPERS in California is a state-owned enterprise. Singapore has a number of very large state-owned enterprises. The difference is there's no discrimination. Germany has a number, and over the years it has, if it gives subsidies to a specific sector that the state-owned enterprise is involved in, they do not discriminate against giving them to others.
So the markets have been reacting up and maybe down a little bit to this news. As you say, quite correctly, we haven't seen the language yet. We need to see the language. But just preliminarily, how should the markets be reacting? Is this good news for the U.S. industry, for U.S. economy?
To the extent that we pull back on our tariffs, it is good news. To the extent that we're moving forward, even if it's a small step, toward eliminating the trade war, it's going in the right direction. Let's hope that we can take many steps, get to the end where we can work with China on the issues that we share and that will require the energies of the two largest economies.